Hey all, welcome back. So you have now had a chance to read William Wilson and comment on it and think about it and get a sense of what this story is about, right? I mean, we began the week by talking about doubles. This, as I said, is a classic story about doubles. I absolutely adore this story. It gets weirder and slipperier and more complicated every time I read it. I do not have it figured out. That's probably one of the reasons that I love it so much. But yeah, I want to talk about it here. So let's dive right in. As you guys know, the story, it's about a rich kid who kind of lives this dissolute life of partying, gambling, drinking. He goes to boarding school where he encounters his double, who shares his name, William Wilson. He increasingly dislikes the double and then leaves school after a bizarre encounter one night where he sneaks into the guy's room, to William Wilson's room, and looks at him with a lantern and sees something horrible. We're not entirely sure what it is that he sees, but then he leaves the school, goes to college, becomes even more villainous, a gambler, a cheat, and his double appears to confront him about this. And then the double goes on to haunt him all over Europe, and they eventually have a violent confrontation in Rome, in which the narrator stabs him to death. So that's the story, but there's a lot going on under the surface, the subtext of this story. So I think the big question that you got to grapple with immediately is, what are we to make of the two doubles in the story? What do the narrator and William Wilson represent metaphorically or symbolically? How are we to understand what's going on with these two guys, these two halves, perhaps? And you guys, I think, did an excellent job with this question. A lot of you, most of you, I think, read the story in such a way that we understand the double, his double, William Wilson, as the narrator's conscience. Right? He appears again and again in the story and tells the narrator that he's doing something wrong. So he's a form of morality, a sense of right and wrong that the narrator himself seems to lack or ignore. So it's this missing part of his psyche. And there's lots of evidence for this. I mean, I'll give you just one. This is a couple pages into the story. He's talking about his double, William Wilson. And we've already seen that William Wilson is one of the people that will resist him, push back against him. He gets his way pretty much with everybody else, but not with William Wilson. So he's telling him what to do and what not to do, right? Which is a form of a conscience. But here's this line, in case you missed it. A couple pages into the story, he says, "Yet at this distant day, let me do him, William Wilson, his double, the simple justice to acknowledge that I can recall no occasion when the suggestions of my rival were on the side of those errors or follies so usual to his immature age and seeming inexperience. That his moral sense, at least, if not his general talents and worldly wisdom, was far keener than my own, and that I might, today, have been a better and thus a happier man, had I less frequently rejected the counsels embodied in those meaning whispers, which I then but too cordially hated and too bitterly despised." Right? So William Wilson is always whispering to him, telling him basically the right things to do, and he doesn't listen. He doesn't listen to his conscience. So I think reading him as the conscience, the superego in this story, is a really smart and defensible way to understand the story. We have then a story of a divided psyche, a divided consciousness. On the one side, right, the narrator's side, we have base desires and selfish behavior. Right? He gets whatever he wants, does whatever he wants. He drinks, carouses. On the other, we have a desire to do the right thing, the moral thing. So the struggle between these two sides characterizes the whole story up to the confrontation. And I think, too, as many of you noted, this dovetails, fits with Freud's theory of the double as well, because Freud argues that the double comes to function as a kind of conscience, a kind of superego, critiquing the subject's actions, deciding what's good and bad. So I think that's a cool reading. And then, I mean, if that's the case, if this is about two halves of the psyche struggling with each other, what does the ending imply? Right? He murders this half of himself. And one way might be to think about it, what would a more positive outcome look like? But I mean, I think the murder there suggests that he fails to unite the two halves of his psyche. He fails, and it breaks him, right? He's consumed or destroyed by the division that remains. And so I think he would have needed to take the conscience on board, to accept it and kind of try and implement it in order for there to have been a kind of healthier way to end the story, a kind of reconciliation between the two halves. It does not happen, right? Okay, so I mean, I think that's a way to understand the doubles. I think that's a way to understand the ending of the story. That all makes sense to me. However, I want to suggest to you that it's not quite that simple, and that maybe Poe is going after something, more complicated and maybe more unsettling here. This is not the only way to read the story, what I'm about to tell you. It's not the only way, but it is a way that I find very compelling, and it starts to make sense of some of the slippier, more bizarre things in the story, I think. So let me try and complicate the reading of the double as simply as the conscience. I mean, I think that's true, but I think there are other things going on. The first clue maybe is the epigraph. It seems to lay out the meaning of the story right there. I mean, this is how a lot of you guys were coming at that. It makes sense to me, right? I mean, if we look at the epigraph really quickly, what's it say? He says, "What say of it? What say conscience grim, that specter in my path?" So there, I mean, in big capital letters right at the beginning of the story, conscience. So it suggests that's the way you're supposed to read the story. Okay, and Poe uses epigraphs like this all the time in his work. He puts these little epigraphs, these little quotes at the beginning of his story. But he doesn't seem to like them much. Let me show you something from another thing that Poe wrote. Okay, never mind. My web recording stuff is not going to let me switch to a document at this point. Anyway, I'll read it to you. So this is from a piece, a totally different piece that Poe wrote. This is not fiction. This is literary criticism. He was also a renowned literary critic, and this is a review he does of a collection of poems by a guy named Longfellow. It's called Longfellow's Ballads. So it's a piece he wrote kind of talking about Longfellow's work. And in the course of that, he talks a little bit about epigraphs. Here it is. Here's what he says. By the prefix, by that he means the epigraph, the thing you put at the front. By the prefix, we are either put in possession of the subject of the poem, or some hint, historic fact, or suggestion is thereby afforded, not included in the body of the piece, which, without the hint, is incomprehensible. In the latter case, while perusing the poem, the reader must revert, in mind at least, to the prefix for the necessary explanation. In the former, the poem being a mere paraphrase of the prefix, the interest is divided between the prefix and the paraphrase. In either instance, the totality of effect is destroyed. This is Poe getting annoyed with epigraphs. He's sort of saying, if you put it in the front and it lays out the whole meaning of the story, then it diminishes the story itself, or the poem he's saying here, right? And then if, in that case, then the whole story is just kind of paraphrasing what's in the thing. And so what's the point of the story? He doesn't like epigraphs. So this seems to me to be a significant clue that something else is going on here. Okay. I think that's a reason to be a little bit leery of the perhaps too easy, this is about conscience, this is about a double and his conscience plaguing him. Because Poe, it's too easy for Poe, right? He doesn't like these epigraphs that explain everything up front. Okay, so something else is going on here. This is my argument, my claim. What I want to suggest is that one way to read this story is as a tale about the destruction of identity. Or better yet, this is a story about the instability of identity. I think William Wilson is uncanny and unsettling because it cleverly highlights the way in which identity is something, not that we're necessarily born with, but that is created, made, perhaps even written in some sense. It's not something that we're, that we're born with and that's always ours. It's forever and always ours, this kind of like internal kernel of us, individuality, right? Instead, it's something that can be stolen, mimicked, or recreated. So thus we see his double, William Wilson, appropriating, taking the narrator's identity. But the anxiety here, I think, is more profound than just identity theft, like, oh, he's pretending to be me. I think the story suggests that our own identity is already a copy. That there is no such thing sort of as the original. That it's kind of copies all the way down. So consider some of my evidence here, right? Names in the story. I asked you to think a little bit about names. You guys did an awesome job with the names and pulling apart William Wilson and thinking about that as a form of doubling itself, the two wills. Somebody did a great bit on Wilhelm, William as a form of Wilhelm and broke William. Good stuff. So I agree with that. We have the doubling that happens with William and Wilson. But we know this is a fake name. So the very moment at which naming happens, in which identity is created in the story, it's a fake. It's not an original. There's no original ever given to us, right? It's only this copy, this fake. And then there's the two names themselves. And some people talked a little bit about this. I want to expand it a little bit. William is interesting, right? Because you can break it down into Will I Am. Not the Black Eyed Peas Will I Am, but just Will I Am, which suggests Will I am Will, which is a name. I name myself, right? I create myself is what that suggests. Will I am Will. I do it. But Will Son suggests the son of Will, right? Thus implying I am the product of another. I did not create myself. So there's a split in the identity right here, right? It's both, identity is both self-created, Will I am, and thus original, and created by another, Will Son, not original. So the name itself seems to contain this kind of tension, I think, in an interesting way. So that's one piece of evidence. The epigraph that we mentioned before, I think, is more evidence of this. A couple people, I think, mentioned there's some controversy about this epigraph. It turns out it's not exactly real. This is another reason I think it's kind of a red herring. It's there to mislead us. We read it and we think, oh, we got everything figured out. But it's actually a misquote. It doesn't come from the play that Poe says it comes from. He says it comes from Chamberlain's Farinita, right? But it comes from another play by Chamberlain. So it's not what he says it is. To me, this suggests another kind of doubling, and another way in which identity is called into question. This quote is not it's not the identity that says it, it's something else. And it's the very first thing. So suddenly, now the epigraph at the beginning, maybe we ought not trust quite so much. Maybe we don't trust the fact that it's going to explain everything. Let me give you one more piece of evidence. The cloak. It seems to me another place where we see that originality called into question. In the scene, the narrator refers to Glendinning, right, the guy that he's gambling with and he's taken all of his money. He calls him a dupe, which means, as you guys I'm sure know, right, dupe means it's somebody easy to fool. They're a dupe. But it also means it's a short form of duplicate, which means a second copy, right? A second copy of a paper, in fact, right? It's a duplicate. You can hear this, yeah, you've heard this before, right? So here we get a bit more doubling. Glendinning is a kind of duplicate of the narrator, right? They're gambling with each other. He's a dupe. And then, okay, so that's the first little bit of doubling. But then check out this line on, in my book, it's 227. It'll be different in your book. Let's see, where is it? This is during the gambling. In a very short period, he had become my debtor to a large amount. So he's winning a bunch of money and the guy's in debt. When having taken a long draught of port, right, a sip of wine, he did precisely what I had been coolly anticipating. He proposed to double our extravagant stakes. With a well-feigned show of reluctance, and not until after my repeated refusal had seduced him into some angry words which gave a color of pique to my compliance, did I finally comply. The result, of course, did prove but how entirely the prey was in my toils. In less than an hour, he had quadrupled his debt. So this language of doubling, right, he doubles the bet, and then it gets doubled again, it gets redoubled. So, okay, the same scene, we've got duplicates, one set of doubles, now we've got the doubling in terms of the gambling itself. Then William Wilson arrives in the form of another double. The candles get blown out or whatever, he shows up. And he leaves a duplicate cloak. So it's almost, there's all this doubling and redoubling that's happening in the scene. It's like the narrator has kind of lost control of the doubling and thus of his own identity. Who, right? Who is who here? Who is what, right? And the cloak itself, I think, further destabilizes the narrator's identity. If you notice, this is on the next page, the description of the cloak. I think this is important. He writes, "The cloak which I had worn was of a rare description of fur. How rare, how extravagantly costly, I shall not venture to say. Its fashion, too, was of my own fantastic invention. For I was fastidious to an absurd degree of coxcombry in matters of this frivolous nature. When, therefore, Mr. Preston reached me that which he had picked up on the floor, and near the folding doors of the apartment, it was with astonishment, nearly bordering upon terror, that I perceived my own already hanging on my arm, where I had no doubt unwittingly placed it. And the one presented me was but its exact counterpart in even the minutest possible particular. Okay? I think this is super interesting, and particularly for that bit where he says, it was my own, it was super expensive, I had it made, it was of my own fantastic invention. So, it's his original creation. There is nothing else like it. He made it up himself, right? He had it specially made. It's totally original until he is then handed an exact copy of it by this guy. Okay, so even the seemingly one-of-a-kind object is duplicated. And to me, this gets at the heart of what I think this story is doing. Nothing is original. Nothing is entirely your own. Not even your identity. Nothing is you all the way down. It's always already a copy. And that's freaky, right? That's unsettling. Suddenly, the pillars of your identity are kind of put into question. And I think that's the source of the anxiety and the weirdness and the scariness of this story. All these kind of tricks that Poe is using to call into question the idea of identity, and the first of which, of course, is this doubling, this splitting, and suggesting the ways in which things are copies of other things and not originals. So that's how I read the story. It calls into question both identity and originality in all kinds of clever ways. And thus, I think, scares the hell out of us because it shows us how what we think is our own distinctive, one-of-a-kind identity, that thing that's most special and individual about ourselves, might in fact just be the duplicate of a duplicate of a duplicate. Right? William Wilson. Okay. Weirdness, awesomeness. There's a lot more to be said about the story. There are lots of other ways to go at it, but I think we'll wrap it up there because next up, Psycho. More madness, more identity troubles, more doubling. All right, talk to you soon.